In the wake of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, abortion has become one of the hottest topics in American politics. But how will abortion and reproductive rights more generally impact the 2024 election? I'm joined by Grace Panetta, who is a political reporter at 19th News. She's been covering the various abortion ballot measures, constitutional amendments, and political fights all around the country for the last 2 years. And she joins the podcast to discuss how those fights will play out in 2024 and how they might impact the battle for the presidency and control of Congress. As always, we appreciate you listening. If you want to recommend us to a friend, like, subscribe, all of those things are appreciated. And if you really enjoy the podcast, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks for listening again, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining us today is Grace Panetta. Grace, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you again. I know you're a alumnus of the podcast, and we're always happy to have you back. And this time, we're talking about what is obviously one of the very biggest issues in American politics. It's abortion and reproductive rights more generally. Sometimes it just gets shortened down to kind of the abortion debate, but it encompasses many things, and I think we'll get into that.
Mm-hmm.
The background here is obviously that Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court just a few years back, and this has sent a tidal wave through American politics, and there's been a lot of commentary about kind of what this has done to politics, especially electoral politics. What has it meant in specific races for Democrats and Republicans and how they're reacting to it? And so I think that's a good place to start off. Before we look at how this is going to impact 2024, what do we already know? What can we already see happening over the last year or two in terms of, is there concrete evidence about how abortion and how Roe v. Wade being overturned has impacted American politics? What do we know?
Yeah. So we know a couple things. The first of which is that voters really do not like abortion bans. In the immediate aftermath of the Roe v. Wade decision, it sent abortion back to the states and allowed many states to pass very strict abortion bans. And those have turned out to be extremely unpopular. The second thing we know is that when voters are given the chance to directly vote on abortion, they vote to expand abortion access and reject efforts to make abortion harder to access. In every case that there's been a ballot measure, statewide constitutional amendment, the pro-abortion right side has won, and that's been the case since 2022. And the third thing we know is that voters also don't think that Republicans really have a lot of credibility on the issue of abortion. In the 2023 elections, we saw in different states and races, Republicans either supporting near total bans, 6-week bans, or in the case of someone like Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, he backed a 15-week ban, and voters rejected that too.
One of the interesting aspects of that, because I think you're right that generally this has been kind of a disaster for Republicans, at least electorally. And like maybe they just genuinely wanted to ban abortion. And in that case, then this is a good idea. If that's your perspective, then this is good. But there's an aspect of this that reminds me of like it's the dog who caught the car. You know, this is the dog has been chasing the car. They've been chasing Roe v. Wade appeal and overturn that decision for decades and decades. And now that it's happened, it's like, okay, what are we going to do? Because things are going poorly for them. And you might think that this would be just, oh, well, a bunch of very, very blue Democratic states have jumped in and passed a bunch of pro-abortion access laws. But it's not just in blue states, is it?
No, it's not in blue states. Shortly after the Roe v. Wade decision was overturned in 2022, there had already been efforts in 2 red states, Kansas and Kentucky, to put anti-abortion measures on the ballot. stating that there's no constitutional right to abortion in those states' constitutions. Kansas abortion is legal there, and it's also a very important abortion access point. And voters there rejected that effort. Voters rejected a similar effort in Kentucky, which does have a pretty strict abortion ban.
Famously blue states, Kansas and Kentucky.
Famously Democratic havens. And then last year in Ohio, there was a pro-abortion rights ballot measure, and it was the first time since the fall of Roe v. Wade that there had been a measure affirmatively expanding and codifying, enshrining abortion rights in what was once a purple state that's now trended pretty red, and that measure passed by about 14 points. So that was a pretty clear signal, too, that voters not only dislike abortion bans, but they will protect abortion rights when it's directly on the ballot. Now, it doesn't mean that they'll vote for Democrats, but it does mean that quote-unquote red state voters who identify as Republican, might be conservative, are willing to enshrine abortion rights. So it's definitely not as clear-cut of a red versus blue state thing.
I'd also love to get your kind of opinion on how this messaging has worked up to this point, because this, what messages have actually been successful in kind of winning some of these abortion access votes. That's going to matter a lot for 2024, right? And we were lucky enough to have Ashley All on the podcast. I'm not sure if you know Ashley.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. But so Ashley, for listeners who haven't heard that episode, she basically is a Kansan who saw that there was an effort in Kansas to ban abortion, basically, from the Kansas conservative movement and the Republican Party. And she said, we're not going to let that happen. And we had her on the podcast to talk about how she managed to, because I was like, how did you do this? Are you a witch? Are you a magician? Is this magic? And to her, it was like very simple that, look, you have to meet Kansans where they are. You can't come in guns blazing, talking like typical progressive New York City, Washington, D.C., East Coast talking points. You've got to meet them where they are. And she actually talked about how they would have like a white male Christian pastor in their advertisements talking about how he didn't think it was, the right idea to ban all abortions, that this was too extreme. And it struck me that, that would make a lot of people mad in certain progressive urban circles, but that like I really love that strategy for the place where it is. So I don't know. Is that something you see as well?
It absolutely is. Yes. Ashley is a super smart strategist. And yeah, in Kansas, a big part of their messaging, which you probably talked about on her episode, was freedom against government intervention. That's how it was phrased in a lot of their ads. Many of them did not even say the word abortion, but they said, Republicans are trying to get in your exam room, get in between you and your doctor, impose all these unnecessary regulations and tell you what to do with your body. And that was a very effective message. And that has also been the case in several other states. It was definitely a big part of the Ohio campaign as well. They talked a lot about personal freedom, freedom from government interference. And to your point also about, highlighting white men, that's obviously a super important part of any pro-reproductive rights coalition in a red Midwestern state. And it is something I also heard on the ground reporting in Ohio, that especially when pro-reproductive rights people and campaigners talked about the lack of exceptions in abortion bans like in Ohio and Kentucky, that was a really mobilizing message that a lot of people, maybe not the traditional demographic you would think of, that activated them in support of these abortion ballot measures. And we did definitely see that play out in the voter data and, which counties voted for the measure in Ohio.
One of the things that's interesting about the current situation is that you have this kind of juxtaposition of red states where, there have been many red states, despite some of these votes, there are many, many red states that do have like total abortion bans or very close to total abortion bans. And then you have blue states that are incredibly permissive. And, some of the most permissive laws on abortion and reproductive rights anywhere in the world, like even more so than most European countries, which I think would shock a lot of people. I guess I'm curious, what are the repercussions that you see of this kind of bifurcated, system that we have where part of the country has incredibly wide open abortion access and reproductive access to reproductive health care, and part of the country is just closed off? Like, are there weird things that are happening because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for some context, too, it's important to note that way before the Supreme Court ever overturned Roe v. Wade, this bifurcated system had already existed. There were many parts of the country where abortion was functionally inaccessible for years before the Supreme Court kind of struck that final blow.
Yeah, you'd have stories about like a state with one abortion clinic or something like that, right?
Yeah, and to that point as well, Texas had this sort of bounty law that had functionally banned abortion in that state for like 9 months before the Dobbs decision. But I think what the Dobbs decision did is it really just heightened and exacerbated those differences we're seeing there. It allowed several states to ban abortion virtually overnight. And in other states, all of a sudden, when there's no constitutional right to abortion left, states are thinking, okay, well, we have this antiquated law from the 19th century on our books. It says abortion is illegal. We don't know how this applies. And in many cases, I think, providers and clinics have been afraid to get in trouble, to be prosecuted in dealing in states with abortion bans where the exceptions are unclear. That's something we've seen time and time again. But it really has created this almost two-tiered system where your access to reproductive health, not just abortion, but all reproductive health, really depends on where you live. And even in the states where abortion is accessible, there are many that have just seen a massive explosion, a huge influx in patients from other states seeking care. Florida is one of those states that's been a big access point. Colorado, Kansas, the Mid-Atlantic, DC area, and to a lesser extent, New England. So it's really meant that a lot of people have not been able to access the care they need, and kind of your access to resources defines your ability to travel.
Are you aware of any statistics on this? Like, did the number of abortions actually go down in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade? Because, with what we're saying, like that there's this kind of situation, well, abortion's not really illegal for anyone if you have the money to travel. So like, has there even been a decline? Because look, if I'm a conservative, what I want is the total number of abortions to go down, because I think they are a moral atrocity, and this is a horrible thing. But one basic question you could ask is, has that even happened, or did we overturn Roe v. Wade and literally there's not any less abortions than there were before?
Well, we just got some new research and data on this. A new study came out, the Monthly Abortion Provision Study, and it found that in 2023, which is the first full calendar year after the Dobbs decision, there were approximately 1 million abortions, so 15.7 per 1,000 women, which actually makes up a 10% increase since 2020. And this is according to the Guttmacher Institute, which studies abortion statistics very closely. But they say it's also the highest number in rate measured in the United States in over a decade. So not only did the overturning of Roe v. Wade not decrease the number of abortions performed in the U.S., it has actually increased. Abortions have increased in the United States in spite of the Supreme Court decision and access being so drastically limited in many places.
It's an odd finding. I'm not sure how to explain that, because I could see a world where like the numbers stay the same because again, people travel or whatever. But the fact that it actually went up is odd. And I'm not I struggle for a theory of like why that would happen.
So the first thing that comes to mind for me is that the vast majority of abortions in the United States are done in the first trimester of pregnancy and with medication abortion. And medication abortion has just become only more accessible over the last couple of decades. And there are, they've become also the center of court battles in a Supreme Court case as well. But medication abortion has only become more accessible in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There were a lot of... And
when you say medication abortion, I just want to make sure I'm understanding and the listeners are. Is this what would we commonly call this Plan B?
No, so Plan B
or is this something different?
This is something different. So Plan B is an emergency contraceptive. It basically prevents egg from fertilizing in the short window after unprotected sex. Medication abortion, it's a 2-pill regimen, mifepristone and misoprostol, and those are taken in conjunction with each other to cause an abortion to terminate a pregnancy in the first trimester.
Gotcha. I wanted to make sure I was, because sometimes, and I think there's even there's a debate in some circles, is is Plan B should that count as an abortion? And I don't know nearly enough about the science to even stake a position there, but I just wanted to make sure we were talking about that. So you were saying that you think this is potentially this trend is just kind of a secular trend that would have been happening anyway because of the ease of access of kind of just you order something in the mail or you get it at a local pharmacy and it's as easy as that?
Oh, yeah. So it's been in the past year, medication abortion has become more accessible, easy to access at pharmacies. But yes, definitely, broader availability of medication abortion through the mail, through telehealth. That's been a factor. And then researchers also think that this overall national increase is driven by particular states that have seen large increases. So Illinois is one. They had a 72% increase over 2020. New Mexico had a 257% increase. Virginia, 76% increase. So we're really seeing that even though nationally access to abortion has become much more limited, there have just been massive efforts in blue states where the procedure is protected to provide more care and to welcome patients coming from other states. And there's also been a lot of mobilization and organizing within the abortion rights movement for things like abortion funds, which provide financial assistance for people to travel out of state if they need.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, that's got to be travel. That's got to be people coming in from other states. So when you say, like, New Mexico, a 250% increase in just a few years, obviously, like, the women of New Mexico are not just going out and getting abortions because it's fun to do. Like, nobody actually likes abortions. That's the thing. Like, even if you think they should be protected, even if you think it's a woman's right to do that, nobody celebrates like, yay, I've on my, buy 9 and get the 10th free. Like, nobody's trying to do that, right? So this must be people coming in from red states to these New Mexico or Virginia or what have you.
Yeah, New Mexico especially borders Texas and it borders Arizona, where access has been a bit legally murky. Utah as well, another nearby state that's restricted abortion. So New Mexico is like super centrally positioned to be getting this big influx coming from other states. Same with Illinois. A lot of neighboring states in the Midwest had banned abortion, and Illinois and New Mexico both have invested a lot of resources into expanding access as well.
So I want to talk a little bit about public opinion and kind of why people are reacting the way they are and kind of where public opinion sits. My understanding of this is that, in the year 2024, and maybe even this seems to actually been pretty steady. Like, if you look at the polling of like, what did people think about abortion in the 90s, it doesn't seem all that different from now, compared to something like gay marriage, where it's just absolute night and day. But, abortion has been relatively steady. There's always been a big camp of people who want to ban it. There's always been a big camp of people who are supportive of abortion rights. But I've always kind of theorized it as like there's a third of people who just are really, really firmly anti-abortion. There's a third of people who are really, really firmly pro-choice. And there's a third of people kind of somewhere in the middle who might support some restrictions, but not all the way. Is that kind of how you also think about this, or is that like out of date?
It's not fully out of date. I think, you're absolutely correct that public opinion, especially on the Roe v. Wade decision, has been remarkably consistent and stable over the past 30 years. Over that time span, it's always been the case that about 2/3 of Americans support the Roe v. Wade decision and a third oppose it and want to see it overturned. And something important, too, when we think about public opinion is that for the dedicated anti-abortion advocates who have dedicated their lives to this cause, they have not been dissuaded by public opinion, right? They've seen this as a much more higher righteous quest that is not determined by political factors. And they achieved their goal in spite of the public opinion being against the overturning of Roe v. Wade for so long. And I think we've continued to see that be consistent. We know that total abortion bans are incredibly unpopular. And that's obviously a little bit murkier when it comes to, for example, 12-week bans or 15-week bans. Those also not only are opposed by most voters in a lot of polls, but we've also seen voters reject politicians and political parties who have tried to put forward a 15-week ban as a compromise or a consensus, which is what Governor Glenn Youngkin tried to do in Virginia. And in talking to Democratic pollsters and strategists who work on this issue, I think the biggest reason behind that is because for a lot of people, it's not about the specific week limit. It's about the broader principle of government intervention and the government coming in and setting a specific week limit at which you can get an abortion, which gets back to what we were saying earlier about the kind of messaging in these ballot measure campaigns about freedom from government interference. It's not about the specific week limit. It's about the general principle. And for a lot of people who may never get an abortion themselves, they still don't want the government to be the one making that decision for them. So those are kind of the trends we've seen. But it's also a bit fluid because I think something I keep hearing in my own reporting is that people's ideas of abortion are constantly shifting. And for a lot of people who did not consider emergency health care to be an abortion are realizing, oh, yes, that is abortion care. And that is now banned in many states. And I do not support that that's banned.
It's really interesting, the point about trust, because I think about this like it's similar to the economy. There's a lot of people for whom, they vote based on the economy, but that doesn't mean that they're actually like reading Joe Biden's budget versus Donald Trump's budget. They're not actually like looking at tax plans. They just kind of have a sense. And this is kind of unfortunate from my perspective because I vote for the Democratic Party, but more people trust Republicans on the economy. And that doesn't mean that if you ask them about the Republicans' tax plan, that they like it better. They just kind of have a sense that the Republicans are more serious on that issue. I just trust them more. And are you kind of making a similar point there where even beyond the specific abortion policy, there's just a sense of we don't trust Republicans on abortion for a lot of people?
Yeah, there is. And I think also to even more so with abortion and reproductive rights in many ways, I think for a lot of voters, it is very clear cut to them where the two political parties stand in a super clear way that's maybe clearer in some ways than some economic issues. I feel like, the economy is a very complex topic, and people often have contradicting opinions about various parts of the economy. But I think
people just vote on vibes a lot. Genuinely, like not to be insulting towards the average voter, but you can kind of be insulting towards the average voter. There's a lot of politics that operates on vibes.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. And I think what's made it clearer for abortion and reproductive rights is there is a very clear delineation that it is true that the Republican Party has spent decades firmly working very hard to overturn Roe v. Wade, working to overturn national abortion rights and just chip away at access and rights in the states. And that's been a very clear concerted project. And it's been the Democratic Party who has advocated for maintaining reproductive rights. And in the wake of the Dobbs decision, that difference has only become more clear. And it's true, we can see this within the parties. There are very, very few pro-abortion rights Republican elected officials and almost no anti-abortion Democrats, whereas it's very different if you think back to 10, 15 years ago, where there was a lot more Democrats who identified as pro-life, for example, and Republicans who called themselves pro-choice. Those people don't really exist that much anymore in our politics. And so I think that's just made the contrast even more clear for the voters.
Yeah, well, I mean, I worry about that just a little bit because I think the Democrats kind of seizing on this idea of like there are like 33% of voters in the middle who don't want to ban abortion entirely, but also don't want abortions on demand, perhaps. And I think the Democrats have been winning those voters in the middle on these ballot challenges by wide margins, simply because they've done a better job of saying, like, look, we're not the extremists. Republicans are the extremists. If a lot of politics is trying to just paint yourself as reasonable and paint your opponent as an unreasonable extremist. And it's been pretty easy to do that with Republicans, right? Because there's decades and decades of them vowing to ban all abortion at an institutional level. That is just kind of how the Republican Party has deeply committed itself. And so it's been pretty easy to say the Republican Party are the extremists here. They don't want you to get an abortion ever under any circumstances. We Democrats can be the reasonable ones. I'm a little bit leery of like giving up I almost wish there were. I think abortion rights. I would always vote for abortion rights, but I almost wish we were a little bit friendlier to people in the Democratic Party who were in that more nuanced zone, if that makes sense.
Well, I would say that I think the Democratic coalition on abortion rights is pretty big. And I think there are other factors that have made it so that there are fewer anti-abortion or more conservative on abortion Democratic elected officials. And in a lot of cases, people in the party have had their own trajectory. For example, think about President Joe Biden. I would argue that he is the leader of the Democratic Party, and he's also kind of in that sort of middle zone that you're talking about. He's very open about the fact that he is a devout, practicing Catholic. Abortion is not his favorite thing to talk about. The idea of it is something that he is not super comfortable with and enthusiastic about. But at the same time, he's still running on this idea, to your point, that the Republicans are the extremists. Democrats are going to, if he wins re-election, Democrats win control of Congress, that they're going to restore Roe v. Wade and restore those rights that are broadly popular. And I think he is able to speak to that middle. And I think, the fact that President Joe Biden is the head of the Democratic Party at this time does show that there is room for people who are a little bit more uncomfortable with the idea of abortion, but who oppose kind of these all-out bans.
Yeah, the other thing is that, we're obviously having to defend ground in a lot of red states, both in constitutional measures, and you talked about Kansas, and I think there's stuff going on in like Florida and Ohio that's happened, and we've got to reach people in kind of red areas of the country, and it can only help to have someone like Joe Biden articulating that message, right? But then also, like, if the Democrats want to win the Senate, they're going to need more like John Testers and Joe Manchins and senators who are comfortable, being from a red state. And, the last time we had the Democrats had like 55 to 60 senators, it was because they were like winning states like Missouri and North Dakota and things like that. Like, that's the path to a majority. And so we've got to, I don't know, I just always worry that like we make sure that we can actually win those states.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, too, is, a lot of people ask, why haven't Democrats already restored abortion rights? They had all these decades to do so. Well, not really, because when Democrats did have a supermajority in the Senate, think back to the late 2000s, early 2010s, it was a lot of more conservative Democrats from red states who were not willing to go as far as to pass national abortion rights. And, to this day, Senator Manchin is one of those who was not on board with the major Democratic bill restoring Roe v. Wade. And I think Senator Manchin is kind of the last of his kind. I think that's the last Democrat elected from West Virginia that we're going to see for a while in the U.S. Senate. But to your point, I think, also these red states like Ohio and Montana, we've already seen in Ohio that voters have affirmatively voted to protect abortion rights. And in the process of the ballot measure last year, all of these Republicans running for Senate had to take positions on that issue. They all said that they would vote for national abortion restrictions. And so I think that really helps someone like Senator Sherrod Brown, the Democrat up for re-election, to say, hey, I support this thing that you also supported, voters. And this guy, my opponent, wants to pass a national ban to override your vote and your say. So I think that could potentially be an effective message for someone like a Sherrod Brown or a John Tester who's running in Montana, where there will also be a ballot measure on abortion rights this November.
So that's a good segue, because you mentioned Montana there. Mm-hmm. And Montana is going to be having a something that, voting on reproductive rights in November. And obviously, there's another big election happening in November this year. We're electing a president. It's either going to be Joe Biden or Donald Trump again. And I'd love to talk about how abortion and reproductive rights and the battles we're having over that are going to influence that. So can you give us kind of a lay of the land in terms of what's actually going to be on the ballot in 2024? What do we have coming up in terms of which states have like different constitutional amendments proposed or referendums or anything like that? What do we know about what's going to be on the ballot?
Great question. And I actually do have an explainer detailing all the different ballot measure efforts happening in the states on the 19th website. But in possibly almost a dozen states, could be ballot measures in expanding abortion access and guaranteeing either a constitutional right to an abortion or going even further and encompassing other reproductive rights. there are 2 blue states, Maryland and New York, where the state legislature has voted to put these efforts on the ballot. And then in other states, they're all citizen-led initiatives. So, and I think all the campaigns right now are still either in the signature gathering phase, where they need to get enough signatures and get those signatures verified to be on the ballot this year. Or in the case of Florida, they submitted all their signatures and they're waiting on a legal review about the language from the state Supreme Court. So it could be a lot of states this November directly voting on abortion with the potential to really change the landscape for access this year.
You mentioned a couple states there, like Florida, but do we have a list of like which potentially swing states might be looking at something? Because, you know, that like if Maryland has something on the one hand, like that's very nice, but also I'm not super concerned with like the state of abortion access in Maryland. And I'm not super concerned with the outcomes of like the presidential election in Maryland. It's not high on my list of things. Whereas something like Florida, you know, not only is that a state where access is much more in danger, right? But it's also a state that could swing a presidential election or control of the Senate in some cases. What do we know about the swing states where some of this stuff will be voted on?
Yeah, so the 2024 battleground, you know, potentially competitive states where advocates are trying to get pro-abortion rights measures on the 2024 ballot are Arizona, presidential swing state, also has a big Senate race. Florida, which has trended more red in recent cycles, but also has both the Senate and presidential race. Montana with Senate race, Nevada as well. So those are kind of the battlegrounds, but it's important to note that there's not really a ton of evidence that Democrats can bank on these measures to, you know, boost Democratic candidates. Politico did a really good data-based analysis on this earlier this year. And, you know, because a lot of these abortion ballot measures get a lot of their support from Republicans and independents, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll also give a boost to Democrats. It may help boost voter turnout, but not necessarily, you know, can't guarantee that it'll help the Democrats who are going to be on the ballot at the presidential and Senate level. But that could change this year also. This is all pretty new territory.
That's interesting because I would have assumed that there would be some effect. And I feel like you're right that we kind of don't know for sure yet. But like even granted, you know, there are going to be some independents and Republicans who just vote one way on abortion access and then might vote another way in a Senate race or for president. But you know, I think it's going to be hard to disentangle. Like there's less and less, cross ballot voting. It used to be, you know, 20, 30 years ago, very common to vote for one party for president and the other party for your congressperson. And people just don't do that very much anymore. And I wonder if like that couldn't be an influence here as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct about that. And the thing, too, about Ohio, which is our most recent example, is that was on the ballot in an off year where there was no presidential race, no Senate race, no other big statewide elections driving turnout. And also, quite frankly, there's also a world in which it's possible that it's not helpful for advocates in red states, for example, to have Joe Biden also being on the ballot or Democratic senator also being on the ballot because they want to make these abortion rights campaigns as cross-partisan and all-encompassing as possible. They may not want these efforts to get nationalized at all.
Yeah, this is a whole different topic, but the Democratic Party for decades has operated on the theory of like increased turnout helps us. We are the party of turnout. And that's no longer true. It's absolutely no longer true that increased turnout helps Democrats. Democrats are now like the more educated party, and college educated voters vote at higher rates. And when a lot of times when you pick up increased voter turnout, it's going to be white voters without college degrees. And that's not a Democratic constituency anymore. So yeah, I think just to echo that point of like, you never know exactly what it might mean to like juice turnout and to like those things can backfire sometimes. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about this. How do you look at the politics of Donald Trump on abortion? Because he's had a weird journey where he's kind of just a mercenary. It kind of seems like he just says whatever he wants, whatever will make people not yell at him in the current moment. Like, does he? I guess here's the question. does he have a definable stance on abortion or not?
At this point, not really. You're absolutely right that Donald Trump has very successfully been able to muddy the waters and confuse about what his exact stance and what his position is. He's always been kind of a unique figure, too, because he's very opportunistic. He embraces positions for political expediency, like he did embracing anti-abortion groups in his first presidential campaign in 2016. And then he later did follow through on his promise to appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe v. Wade. He did do that. He touted doing that, while at the same time also attacking Ron DeSantis from the center and saying, oh, it was so terrible that Ron DeSantis signed the 6-week abortion ban into law in Florida. He's openly criticized and feuded with prominent anti-abortion groups who a lot of Republican candidates need their endorsement. And Trump has kind of put himself in a class of his own on this issue, and there is evidence that it's not really breaking through yet, maybe yet, to voters, that Trump, could potentially have a very significant impact on abortion access if he was elected to a second term. Data for Progress did a poll in December that gave voters multiple choice options as to who they held responsible for the overturning of Roe v. Wade and new abortion restrictions. And they found that only a quarter of the voters polled named Trump, which says a lot, I think, about Trump's sort of very unique position and his ability to muddy the waters in a way.
I mean, and like you said, the practical impact, if Trump is reelected, he is going to be an anti-abortion president, and he is going to continue to appoint judges that will rule against abortion rights. And I don't think there's any doubt in that. And if he gets elected president and an anti-abortion bill comes through Congress and reaches his desk, he's going to sign it.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be in doubt, but that seems to me like it really does seem transactional on his part. I don't buy him as an abortion culture warrior. I don't think he actually gives a shit, basically.
Yeah, no,
this is very transactional. And I remember when some of these disappointing results that Republicans have had in the last few years, since Joe Biden was elected, you normally get a red wave. The party that is opposing the president's party normally does well in the midterms, and you didn't get much of that in 2022, right? And there's been all these disappointing results, and there's reports that Donald Trump is blaming the abortion. The abortions are just, that's what's doing it to us. We shouldn't have done the abortion. And he just calls it the abortion, I think, which is also very funny. But I don't know. It seems to him it's, I don't know. That's my read on it, is that this is a very mercenary thing for him.
Oh, it absolutely is. I think transactional is absolutely the right word. I think both he and anti-abortion groups are pretty open about the fact that they have a transactional relationship with him, and they'll work with him as they need to advance their own goals, even if they wish that he would support a 6-week ban or whatever. But you're right. Trump has not only just reported, but he's openly blamed the quote unquote abortion issue for Republicans losing elections in the 2022 midterms. He's also reportedly, in thinking about who to pick as his running mate, asked if potential running mates are quote unquote okay on abortion and if they support the 3 exceptions. So he does have kind of a sense that it is, embracing a total abortion ban is a losing issue politically. It's also correct that it's not one that he feels especially passionate about. And he's reportedly sort of embraced or will embrace the 16-week ban idea, which, kind of gets him in the middle where he's not embracing a full ban, but he is kind of, also feeding into what these anti-abortion groups who have given him a lot of support over the years, what they want.
Yeah. I mean, if there's one thing that Trump is good at politically, because the man was elected president, he did something correct to get people's votes. And I think it's that he's very willing to just have no actual scruples and just do whatever people want him to do. It was very telling, in 2016, when every other Republican was still running on the Paul Ryan playbook of we have to slash Medicare, we have to cut Social Security. And Trump was the only one who was I love Social Security. We'll never cut it. I'm going to triple it. And he's just he doesn't have any scruples about that. He doesn't give a shit, but he just knows it's not going to get him yelled at. And to some extent, that's actually like a political superpower that he doesn't actually believe in anything. So he can just do whatever will not get him yelled at.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It is a political superpower in like the most perverse way possible.
Yeah.
But it could be a superpower to have,
I mean, the one thing he believes is that like Mexicans coming across the border is like the worst thing that's ever happened in human history.
Yeah.
He's very consistent on that. But other than that, I don't know. But we're getting off topic now. So I guess I want to, as we kind of reach the end of the hour here soon, I want to ask about kind of what Democrats should be doing and how they should be planning this. If you are someone who would like to see Joe Biden reelected and Democrats to take control of Congress and abortion rights to be protected, if that's your point of view, what should Democrats be doing in these races across the country? How will they best utilize this issue? Because politics is about, right? It's about hitting your opponents where they're weak and not getting hit where you're weak. So how can Democrats make this an issue that is a winning issue for them?
So I think the number one thing that's going to keep this a winning one for Democrats is not because of anything that they're doing, but because we're still seeing the ramifications of abortion bans and of kind of the natural conclusion of the logic behind the anti-abortion movement. And we've seen this very prominently with the decision last month from the Alabama Supreme Court, ruling that frozen embryos created through IVF are children, and that decision brought fertility treatment in the state to a halt. And that is, you can draw a direct line from the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the passing of abortion bans and anti-abortion amendments in a place like Alabama to that. And now, because of that, a whole other area of reproductive health is threatened. And I personally myself have been to Alabama twice to report on since that decision came down. So that tells you a lot right there. I did not have that on my bingo card. But to the broader point, I think it is going to stay a top issue because as long as abortion bans are having real consequences for real people's lives, it's going to be an issue. As long as other forms of reproductive health care that maybe people did not think were under threat are under threat. And yet again, it's the dog catching the car, and Republicans aren't able to, have a clear message in response. That is all very helpful for Democrats. And I think what we've seen that they have been doing, we've seen this coming from the Biden campaign, are emphasizing that it's an issue of values and an issue of freedom, reclaiming this idea of freedom kind of from government interference. That's one. Another one we've seen, and something I've written a lot about, is a lot of...
Yeah, but by the way, when did liberals say that like conservatives get to own the word freedom? That's stupid. I love freedom too. Like, I'm a liberal. Like, what? I take that back. Absolutely, right?
Yeah, for sure. And
anyways, sorry to interrupt you there,
good.
but I just had that thing of like, why did we even let that happen in the first place? They don't get to own freedom.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of like when people say like waving an American flag or like being patriotic is like conservative coded. And I'm like, but why? Like, I love America too. Anyway, I'm getting on my bullshit now.
Oh, so. You're good. Well, I also think that was like a big post 9/11 thing that happened, a kind of a realignment. And now maybe that's shifting back to where Democrats can reclaim this idea of freedom more. But anyway, so it's running on these messages that have been proven to work about values, freedom from government interference, elevating personal stories. I think Democrats have done a very effective job of that. There have been a lot of very brave, courageous women who have had horrific experiences as a result of abortion bans, and they've stepped forward to tell their stories. I think that moves people and moves votes in politics. And the other is just emphasizing that it doesn't stop with abortion. As very clearly evidenced by the decision in Alabama, if, operating off the idea that, life begins at conception and abortion is murder, which a big swath of the Republican Party has been doing for decades, stuff like what happened in Alabama is the end result of that thinking and that logic. And
a lot of people know people who have, used in vitro fertilization to have a child. And in Alabama, essentially banning in vitro fertilization. The ruling is slightly more complicated, but just to say it shortly, I always go back to that thing again in politics. You want to paint your opponent as the extreme crazy one who's just totally unreasonable, and yourself as the reasonable person who's just trying to make do in this crazy world. And I think the Republicans have made it kind of easy to paint themselves as the crazy ones, and that you've got to lean into that. You've got to seize on the things where they're like, Republican courts are banning in vitro fertilization or banning birth control or things like that.
Yeah, and I think, to a large extent, Republicans in the anti-abortion movement, they've achieved their victory, but they were not prepared for their victory. And we can see this. They continue to struggle to message on abortion. Ohio just had their Senate primary, and the winning candidate, Bernie Moreno, who's endorsed by Trump, literally said in a debate that women don't need to have abortion rights because if they're traveling on a plane, people will help them put their strollers into the overhead compartment.
Well, then why? Yeah, it's a convincing argument. What other argument against abortion could there be for abortion could there be except people aren't going to help me with my stroller?
Yeah,
that's
clearly
what I worry about.
Yeah, it really keeps me up at night. But yeah, I think as long as Republicans don't have a message of their own that is working, and as long as we're seeing the consequences of these decisions and these laws play out in real time, that creates an opening for Democrats to have a clear and coherent message of their own. And I think that they will continue to do so, as we've seen throughout this election cycle.
It has been interesting to watch the Republican messaging, since you mentioned that, like that it's confused and not clear, because, there's just been decades of, kind of, as long as Roe v. Wade existed, is how I would put it. As long as it existed, they could just say whatever they wanted. They could be as anti-abortion as they possibly wanted to be. And it didn't really matter because Roe v. Wade protected rights. So you could just go up there and say, no abortion ever under any circumstances. And it didn't matter because, you were never going to implement that because Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. And so you have built up several decades of that. Mm-hmm. Now you discover it's very, very unpopular, and you get a lot of Republicans backtracking from that, but not all of them. But some are backtracking really, really fast on, well, we don't need to ban it entirely, but blah, 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 blah. And so like there's this kind of muddle where like nobody really actually knows what they should say on the Republican side. They're all afraid to say one thing, afraid to also say the other thing. Like, I don't know. It's muddled.
It is muddled. I think we've seen that play out really clearly in the wake of this IVF ruling out of Alabama, because if you are a congressional Republican, you have spent your entire career, possibly adding up to decades of your career, supporting support from anti-abortion groups and signing on to these anti-abortion messaging bills like the Life at Conception Act. And then all of a sudden, something like the Alabama decision comes down and you quickly rush to say, oh, I support IVF, except you've signed on to this bill that defines life at conception, and the U.S. House version of the Life at Conception Act has no carve-outs or exceptions for IVF. And those are inconsistent positions. You can't say that you support IVF treatment, which includes the disposal of embryos, and then also say, oh yeah, but life begins at conception. So I really think the rubber's kind of hitting the road there, and it's hard to kind of explain those positions.
All right, so we're coming up on time now. I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask here, which is, where can people go to learn more? If they want to learn more about the legal battles that are taking place all across the country, if they want to hear more about people's stories, how people are impacted, where can they go to learn more about this?
You can go to our website, 19thnews.org. We have really comprehensive coverage of everything related to abortion, reproductive rights, and the politics surrounding it. We have been since the Dobbs decision, and we'll be continuing to cover this topic closely all year. So 19thnews.org, you can learn more. And then I am Grace_Panetta on X, the website formerly known as Twitter.
We haven't abandoned it yet.
We're
yet. Still hanging on by a thread.
Yeah.
Oh God, I just realized the thread is a pun in this context.
Yeah.
Because of threads. I don't know. I've tried to use other services, but it's such a pain in the butt to like post something on I have an idea. Let me go post it on Blue Sky and Threads and Twitter. I don't know. I'll probably abandon Twitter at some point, but not yet. Is my goal.
Not yet. I feel like until there's a really viable alternative, I feel like Threads have just not been it. And obviously it's a meta platform too, so they suppress a lot of political content, which is not great.
Yeah, they deprioritize news, and I assume eventually there will be a tidal wave out, in the way that Dig died, and within a month everybody on Dig was at Reddit. At some point there's going to be it tips over and everybody leaves. But anyway, we're very glad to have had you on. This is obviously going to be a big, big issue for the entire rest of the year in this 2024 election. I want to thank you one more time for joining us, Grace Panetta.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been great. Really appreciate it.